She became one of Europe's most successful illustrators. Vogue published her work. Paris celebrated her talent. But today, most people remember Gerda Wegener for something completely different. One unexpected decision inside her own studio changed not only two lives, but the way the world would remember them forever. Gerda Marie Frederica Gottlieb was born in the spring of 1886 in rural Jutland, Denmark. Her father was a Lutheran clergyman whose family traced its roots to French-speaking immigrants. Life in their home followed familiar rules. For the daughter of a pastor, the future seemed almost predetermined: marriage, family, and a quiet provincial life. Gerda had different plans. From an early age, she filled her time with drawing. Faces fascinated her. So did fabrics, gestures, elegant clothing, and the endless variety of human expression. While many young artists of her generation focused on landscapes or classical subjects, Gerda was already drawn to people, especially women. She loved observing how confidence, mystery, playfulness, and emotion could all appear in a single glance. At the beginning of the 20th century, becoming a professional artist was still a difficult path for most women. Gerda refused to accept those limitations. In 1902, while still a teenager, she left home for Copenhagen and enrolled at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. That decision changed everything. At the academy, she met a quiet young landscape painter named Einar Wegener. He was 4 years older than Gerda and almost her opposite in personality. While she enjoyed people, conversation, fashion, and movement, Einar seemed happiest surrounded by silence. He loved the Danish countryside, its lakes, soft northern light, and peaceful landscapes. Friends described him as thoughtful, reserved, and unusually gentle. Art brought them together almost immediately. They shared studios, exchanged ideas, encouraged one another, and gradually fell in love. Gerda was 18 when they married in 1904. At the time, they looked like any other young artistic couple trying to build a future together. No one could have imagined that, within a few decades, newspapers across Europe would be writing about both of them. After graduation, they began pursuing their careers. Einar quickly earned respect as a landscape painter. His quiet Scandinavian scenes captured the atmosphere of Denmark with remarkable sensitivity. Critics admired his ability to paint light, mist, and stillness. Gerda's path turned out very differently. She realized that landscapes weren't what excited her most. She wanted to paint people. More specifically, she wanted to paint women, not as passive figures, but as confident, elegant, fashionable, and undeniably modern. At the same time, she began working as an illustrator, and commissions soon followed. Her drawings felt fresh, stylish, and perfectly suited to the rapidly changing world of magazines and fashion publishing. Before long, she was earning more than her husband. That was unusual enough on its own. But Gerda wasn't satisfied with the opportunities Denmark could offer. Copenhagen was simply too small for the ambitions she had begun to develop. If she wanted to reach the international art world, there was really only one destination: Paris. In 1912, Gerda and Einar moved there permanently, and almost overnight, the scale of their lives changed. Paris, in the early 20th century, wasn't just another European capital. It was where artists reinvented themselves. Fashion houses shaped global trends. Writers, musicians, designers, and painters gathered in cafes until dawn, arguing about ideas that would influence an entire generation. The city was far from free by modern standards, but compared with Denmark, it offered something invaluable: room to experiment. Gerda immediately found her place. She exhibited at the Salon d'Automne, the Salon des Indépendants, and the Salon des Humoristes. Her illustrations appeared in some of Europe's most fashionable publications, including Vogue, La Vie Parisienne, Fantasio, Le Rire, and La Baïonnette. Her elegant women, with elongated silhouettes, luxurious dresses, expressive eyes, and unmistakable Art Deco style, became instantly recognizable. Interior design projects, commercial illustration, portrait commissions, and decorative art followed one after another. By the mid-1920s, her reputation had spread well beyond France, and at the 1925 International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris, she received 2 gold medals for her work. From the outside, it looked as though everything she had dreamed about was finally coming true. But just as Gerda reached the height of her artistic success, something happened inside her own studio that would change both of their lives forever. And it began with what seemed like an ordinary favor. One day, Gerda was working on a portrait of the Danish opera singer Anna Larsen. Her model hadn't arrived, the session was slipping away, and she needed someone to stand in just long enough to finish a few details. She turned to Einar with a simple request. Would he mind putting on a pair of stockings and women's shoes so she could complete the painting? At first, he hesitated. Eventually, he agreed. Different versions of the story exist, and some details vary depending on the source. But nearly every account agrees on one thing. What began as a practical solution became something neither of them expected. Einar didn't react with embarrassment. Instead, he experienced an unexpected sense of comfort. Gerda noticed it almost immediately. Rather than seeing something strange or alarming, she saw a remarkable artistic possibility. She asked him to pose again, then again. Each new session became more elaborate. Hats replaced simple props. Dresses replaced borrowed accessories. Jewelry, hairstyles, gloves, elegant fabrics. Little by little, an entirely new character began to take shape. Eventually, that character received a name: Lili. At first, Lili existed only inside the studio. She was a model, an artistic creation, almost a private game shared between 2 creative people. Gerda painted her repeatedly, refining the same graceful face, elongated neck, expressive eyes, and elegant posture that perfectly matched the sophisticated style she had already become known for. Collectors loved these paintings. Magazine editors wanted more. Viewers admired the mysterious women who appeared again and again in Gerda's work, never realizing that the face inspiring so many of them belonged to her own husband. Lili seemed perfectly suited to the world of Art Deco. Elegant, confident, stylish, a little mysterious. The more Gerda painted her, the more convincing she became, not only on canvas, but in real life. It didn't stay inside the studio for long. Lili soon began accompanying Gerda to dinners, exhibitions, and social gatherings. Depending on the situation, introductions varied. Some friends were told she was Einar's sister. Others believed she was Gerda's cousin. Parisian society found the story unusual, but not impossible. The city's artistic circles had long embraced eccentric personalities and unconventional lives. What outsiders saw as a curious performance gradually became something much deeper. For Einar, Lili was no longer simply a role. He spent more and more time living as her. He became increasingly uncomfortable returning to his public identity as Gerda Wegener. His interest in painting began to fade. The landscapes that had once defined his career appeared less frequently, until they almost disappeared altogether. Friends noticed the change. Conversations that had once revolved around color, composition, and the Danish countryside shifted towards something much more personal and much harder to explain. Years later, accounts based on Einar's own writings and the memories of people close to him described a growing feeling that he was living someone else's life. Painting itself became painful. Every finished landscape reminded him of an identity he no longer recognized. For decades, people have tried to simplify Gerda's role in this story. Some portray her as the person who encouraged the transformation. Others describe her only as a victim. Neither version tells the whole truth. the reality appears far more complex. Gerda didn't turn away. She didn't forbid Lili from existing. She continued painting her, supporting her, and, above all, seeing beauty where many other people would have seen only scandal. Her own work evolved during these years as well. The women she painted became even more expressive, theatrical, and psychologically complex. Art historians have often suggested that Gerda wasn't simply fascinated by feminine beauty itself. She was fascinated by identity, by the idea that personality could shift, transform, and reveal different sides of itself. Her figures rarely feel static. They seem to be performing, hiding something, revealing something, or existing somewhere between appearance and reality. Looking back, it's difficult not to wonder whether that sensitivity made Gerda one of the first people to recognize what Einar himself was only beginning to understand. But artistic acceptance couldn't solve the deeper struggle. Inside, Einar's conflict continued to grow. By the late 1920s, he had almost completely stopped painting. Depression, emotional exhaustion, and a growing sense that he could no longer continue living as before began to dominate his life. Ahead of them was a decision that seemed almost unimaginable for its time, one that would place both of their names on newspaper front pages across Europe. By the end of the 1920s, Gerda and Einar's marriage looked nothing like it had when two young art students first met in Copenhagen. They had spent more than 20 years together. They had survived financial struggles, built careers side by side, left Denmark behind, and reinvented themselves in Paris. Gerda had become one of Europe's most successful illustrators and portrait artists. Einar, meanwhile, had almost disappeared from the art world. His landscapes no longer appeared in exhibitions, and conversations about his work slowly faded away. More and more, every part of their shared life revolved around Lili. To people on the outside, it could still seem like another eccentric story from bohemian Paris. Inside their home, however, something far more profound was happening. According to later accounts based on Einar's own writings and the recollections of those close to him, he struggled with growing depression, emotional exhaustion, and the overwhelming feeling that he could no longer continue living as the person everyone expected him to be. There were periods when he barely left the house. He withdrew from friends, stopped working for weeks at a time, and later described the painful feeling that he wasn't trying to become someone else. He simply could no longer remain the person the world believed he was. Today, it's easy to forget how extraordinary that situation was. Modern endocrinology didn't exist. Gender-affirming medicine was still in its infancy. Even the language used to describe gender identity was completely different from what we know today. Most doctors either refused to discuss such cases or dismissed them as psychiatric disorders. France offered no real answers, so Gerda and Einar turned to Germany. At the time, Berlin and Dresden were among the world's leading centers for research into human sexuality and endocrinology. There, they came into contact with physicians whose work would later become part of medical history, including sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld and gynecologist Kurt Varnekroos in Dresden. Germany became the place where one of the earliest documented medical transitions of its kind began. In the spring of 1930, Einar started a series of experimental medical procedures. It wasn't one operation, despite the simplified version that later entered popular culture. The process unfolded over many months and involved multiple surgeries, long periods of recovery, and enormous medical uncertainty. No doctor could promise success. No one truly understood what the long-term outcome might be. Einar signed documents releasing the physicians from responsibility, fully aware of the risks. According to those who knew him, he believed there was simply no path back to the life he had been living. After the first procedures, he officially began using the name Lili Elbe. New photographs appeared. She attended public events openly, gave interviews, and eventually received official documents under her new identity. Across Europe, newspapers seized on the story. Some described it as a medical breakthrough. Others condemned it as dangerous madness. Public fascination grew with every headline. Yet amid all that attention, Gerda's own position became increasingly complicated. For years, people have tried to cast her either as the person who encouraged these changes or as someone whose life was destroyed by them. Neither version reflects the full picture. She stayed. She accompanied Lili through treatment, remained by her side during recovery, and helped her adjust to a completely new life. At the same time, she was watching her own marriage quietly come to an end. This wasn't simply a change in appearance. The man she had married at the age of 18 was gradually disappearing, and no amount of love or loyalty could stop that process. In the autumn of 1930, the Danish government officially annulled their marriage, a decision personally approved by the King of Denmark. Legally, their relationship had ended. Emotionally, it hadn't. They remained connected even after the divorce, bound by decades of shared memories, artistic collaboration, and mutual respect. After the surgeries, Lili tried to build an independent life. She returned to Denmark, gave painting lessons, attempted to sell her own work, and gradually became a public figure in her own right. Society, while still divided, began treating her with more curiosity than outright hostility. But for Lili, the journey still didn't feel complete. She dreamed of marrying again. More than that, she dreamed of becoming a mother. Today we know that wasn't medically possible. But in the early 1930s, medicine was still exploring ideas that had never been attempted before. Lili agreed to undergo another experimental procedure involving a reproductive organ transplant. It was an extraordinary risk for its time. Her body couldn't survive the complications. An infection developed, and despite weeks of medical care, Lili Elbe died on September 13, 1931, at the age of 48. She was buried in Dresden, although her original grave was later lost during post-war redevelopment of the city. For Gerda, Lili's death marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter. In 1931, she married again, this time to Italian military officer Fernando Porta. Together they moved to Morocco, hoping for a fresh start. It didn't last. The marriage ended in divorce only a few years later. And in 1938, Gerda returned to Denmark alone. By then, the world that had made her famous had almost disappeared. Art Deco was fading. Fashion had changed. Paris was no longer the city that had embraced her bold illustrations and glamorous women. She held her final exhibition in 1939, but it attracted little attention compared to the triumphs of earlier decades. On July 28, 1940, Gerda Wegener died in Fredericksburg at the age of 54. Stories about alcohol addiction occasionally appear in popular articles and online retellings, but they aren't supported by reliable historical evidence. Art historians generally treat those claims with caution or avoid repeating them altogether. What can be stated with confidence is that her final years were far more modest than the glamorous life she had once enjoyed in Paris. Her health had declined, her artistic circle had largely disappeared, and the fame she had worked so hard to build had quietly faded away. There is a certain irony in her story. During her lifetime, Gerda exhibited in Paris, published illustrations for Vogue and some of Europe's most influential magazines, received 2 gold medals at the 1925 International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts, and became one of the continent's most commercially successful illustrators. Yet after her death, she was almost forgotten. It would take decades before museums and collectors began rediscovering her work, first as an important example of Art Deco, and later as the work of an artist whose career had long been overshadowed by the extraordinary story of Lili Elbe. That may be the greatest injustice of all. Sometimes an artist disappears from history completely. Sometimes they're remembered only because they happen to know someone more famous. Gerda Wegener fell into a different category. For generations, people spoke about her almost exclusively through Lili's story, as though her paintings were merely illustrations to someone else's life. But if we set that remarkable story aside for a moment, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Long before history remembered Lili Elbe, Europe already knew Gerda Wegener. She had earned her reputation through talent, discipline, and an unmistakable artistic voice. She transformed fashion illustration into fine art, painted women with confidence instead of convention, and celebrated beauty without apology. More importantly, she had an extraordinary ability to see people not simply as the world saw them, but as they saw themselves. Perhaps that's why her portraits still feel so alive today. They aren't asking us to admire perfect beauty. They're asking us to look beyond appearances and recognize something far more complicated and far more human. So, were you surprised by Gerda Wegener's story? Or did you already know that one of the most remarkable artists of the Art Deco era had been overshadowed by the extraordinary life of someone she loved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more fascinating stories from the world of art to life. And if you'd like to support today's artists and talented handmade creators, visit alabrio.co. Discover original artwork, connect with creators from around the world, and become part of a growing creative community. See you in the next video.